Test.
Welcome, everybody, to our virtual panel entitled Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure, How Digital Defenses Impact Military Mobility. I'm Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe, now serving as the Pershing Chair at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. I'm speaking to you today from Frankfurt, Germany. Our panel today is the third in CEPA's monthly series on the topic of military mobility. These panels, each of which focuses on a different aspect of military mobility, are leading up to our military mobility workshop, which we hope to conduct 19 to 21 October this year in Brussels. The workshop will use 5 different working groups to examine 5 scenarios touching all of Europe, from Scandinavia to the Baltics, to the Black Sea, to the Balkans, and across the Mediterranean, involving nearly 150 representatives and experts from all across Nato, each of the relevant agencies of the European Union and the European Parliament, several European national headquarters, multiple think tanks, professional journalists, and relevant industry experts who can talk rail, cyber, bridging, wheeled and tracked vehicles, and air and missile defense. Today's panel is going to focus specifically on cyber protection of transportation infrastructure. The topic of military mobility has taken on increased significance for military planners in today's security environment and a return to deterrence. Several studies have been published in the past few months, including by RAND, the Swedish Defense Research Institute, FOI, the International Center for Defense Studies in Thailand, and the Atlantic Council, each of which helped advance the understanding and importance of military mobility. One of the key elements of military mobility is reliance on host nation transportation infrastructure and capabilities. The deployment of NATO rotational forces in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as movements for major military exercises, have highlighted our reliance on host nation support, including airports, seaports, railroads, and local commercial networks, nearly all of which are privately owned and operated by commercial vendors. This includes the cyber protection for this infrastructure, which is typically provided by commercial vendors. I recently read a fascinating article by Andy Greenberg in Wired magazine about the Russian hacking attack in 2017, NotPetya, that was directed against a Ukrainian software business, but which ricocheted around the world, hitting multiple targets, including the giant shipping company Maersk. The result of the attack on Maersk, a commercial vendor, which by the way supports military deployments, was several weeks of widespread disruption due to lost knowledge of the location of ships and containers, as well as hundreds of millions of euro in lost revenues. That article opened my eyes to the vulnerability of our transportation infrastructure to cyber attacks. Such an attack against Bremerhaven, for example, would be just as disruptive to NATO movements as if an Iskander missile attack had hit this critical German seaport. And it would be much more difficult to attribute it to the Kremlin, thus slowing down NATO's response time. This obviously makes cyber a very attractive weapon for the Kremlin and for the Chinese Communist Party. Budget pressures in the post-COVID era will cause governments to re-examine priorities as they look to salvage severely damaged economies, and the recent EU budget that was just released included a much smaller allocation for military mobility than had originally been considered. Yet all of the threats that existed 6 months ago are still with us now and will still be with us 6 months from now. So how do we continue the effort to improve military mobility within this context? Today's panel of experts will help us find a way. Retired Marine Corps Colonel Tom Greenwood is a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis in Alexandria, Virginia, where he focuses on strategy, defense policy, and joint warfare. He served 31 years in the United States Marine Corps as an infantry officer, conducting the full range of operations around the world. Before retiring in 2008, he commanded the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit and served as the director of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College. Tom has served on the U.S. Joint Staff and in the National Security Council for 3 different presidents. Ms. Sabina Wolf is a freelance journalist working mainly for German public broadcasters Bayerischer Rundfunk and ARD. She's an analyst of global, political, economic, and IT topics for more than 20 years. A specialist in investigative journalism, she covers IT security, incitement and extremism on the internet, attacks on critical infrastructure, money laundering, terror funding, copyright infringement, and counterfeiting. In-depth interviews with personalities from German economy and politics add to her professional on-camera experience. She is often a presenter at conferences, including Europol, the Munich Security Conference, and the American German Business Club. She has received numerous professional awards, including the Bayerischer Fernsehpreis and the Ernst Schneider Preis der Deutschen Wirtschaft 4 times. Mr. Edvinas Kerza is the former Vice Minister of the Lithuanian Ministry of National Defense. In that post, he was responsible for the development and implementation of cyber defense policy for all of Lithuania. Before his assignment at the Ministry of Defense, he was in charge of managing key information systems projects at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania. He has also served in the permanent representation of the Republic of Lithuania to the European Union. Mr. Kerza is now the Director of Corporate Resilience Service at the Ignitis Group, a Lithuanian strategic energy company. Our fourth panelist is Colonel Jaak Tarien. Colonel Tarien is the director of the Nato Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn, Estonia, since September 2018. The Cyber Defense Center of Excellence is a NATO-accredited cyber defense hub focusing on research, training, and exercises, providing a 360-degree look at cyber defense with expertise in the areas of technology, strategy, operations, and law. Prior to joining the Center of Excellence, Colonel Tarien served as commander of the Estonian Air Force from August 2012 to July 2018. He has also served at NATO's Allied Command Transformation, Regional Airspace Surveillance Coordination Center, and the BaltNet Regional Airspace Surveillance Coordination Center in Lithuania. Colonel Tarien, by the way, is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy. Apparently, Jack, you were not accepted into West Point, but at least the Air Force Academy took you, which I'm proud of you for. All right, that was unfair. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to start with questions for our 4 panelists for the first 30 minutes or so, and then we'll go to questions from our audience for the final 30 minutes. For all of our listeners, please use your Q&A function on Zoom at the bottom of the screen. Type in your questions, and we'll get to as many as possible. Tom, I'm going to come to you first to help set the stage. You and a colleague recently published an article in the online blog War on the Rocks entitled, "The Pentagon Should Train For and Not Just Talk About Great Power Competition." What inspired you to write this article? And for those listeners who have not read it, could you summarize the major points?
Well, let me begin by thanking you, General Hodges, and CEPA for hosting this important discussion today on cybersecurity and critical infrastructure in Europe, and for inviting me to be on the panel. I want to make clear at the outset that the views I'm expressing today are my own and are not representing the Institute for Defense Analysis of the U.S. government. And now to your question, Ben. My co-author, Owen Daniels, and I were motivated to write this article on the need to ramp up training for great power competition and conflict for 3 reasons. First, after 2 decades of being focused almost exclusively on counterinsurgency operations and nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq, it is apparent that US and NATO forces have to relearn how to conduct joint and combined multi-domain, or what is sometimes called all-domain operations across air, land, sea, space, and cyber domains against other major powers on a scale not observed since the Cold War. And a key component to making this transition from conducting counterinsurgency operations in the Middle East is ensuring our forces are trained and ready to confront sophisticated adversaries like Russia and China. Second, we believe major training exercises are an excellent vehicle for commanders in their headquarters, especially military logisticians, and supporting civilian government agencies to grapple with the challenges of having to integrate multiple services and nations into a unified concept of operations that is then subjected to rigorous testing under real-world field conditions. If properly evaluated by a set of umpires and observers or assessment teams, we believe the insights gleaned from these exercises can expose potential show-stopping gaps and seams that can be mitigated before conflict occurs. And lastly, both the US and our allies and partner nations have a rich exercise history that is fast becoming a distant memory to current generation. Exercises like Reforger or the return of forces to Germany were conducted annually during the Cold War and required strategic air and sea lift to move US forces across the Atlantic, where they married up with pre-position equipment and their NATO counterparts, and then transited over European transportation networks to tactical assembly areas where maneuvers commenced. From 1978 to 1993, the US did the same each spring in the Pacific with exercise Team Spirit in South Korea. Had COVID-19 not resulted in Defender Europe 20 being curtailed, it would have been the largest deployment of US forces to Europe in more than 25 years. Hopefully Defender 21 can go a bit longer to compensate for that lost time. But these are some of the major points that we tried to make in our article.
Hey, Tommy, thanks. So you highlight a couple of things. Of course, the reliance on seaports and airports for Reforger, same thing for Team Spirit, but also pre-position equipment that was part of these exercises. Now, as a Marine officer, you used to do this from Norway as well, where the Marines kept a lot of equipment stored in caves. And as you may know, one of the scenarios we're going to use on our military mobility workshop is to move equipment from Norway to Estonia, which means it's also got to go through Sweden and it has to cross the Baltic Sea. What are some of the things you recall? What kind of host nation support, for example, did you get from the Norwegians that we could expect in a crisis or pre-crisis situation?
Well, General, I think that's a great question. And I think that the experience that I went through, although dated, still has relevance to today. The US and NATO's ability to project combat power across the global commons and within theaters is essential to being able to have distributed forces converge and create all domain effects against the sophisticated adversary. Now, in my time, various means of strategic mobility were used to transport Marines to Norway. One year it'd be by US Navy ship, the next year by fly-in echelon aboard civilian aircraft, and then leased Norwegian ferries would move us through the fjords to the high north. The stress that these Norway exercises placed on ports and airfields, movement control centers, contracting officers, and command and control was absolutely superb because we were training as we planned to fight. And I'm actually pleased to report that last year in the Aero exercise 2019, US forces deployed to Finland for live fire and force-on-force training. This required the use of Norwegian ferries and railways belonging to Finland, Sweden, and Norway. And as you just mentioned, scenario one of the CEPA workshop will involve moving equipment from Norway and Sweden across the Baltic Sea to Estonia. The hurdles and complexities involved in such large-scale intra-theater movement of critical warfighting material should not be underestimated, and nor should the challenges of harsh weather or for potential adversary interference, which could include non-kinetic targeting of electric grids, railway switching centers, and computer-based port operations. Again, this is all the more reason why we need to be relentless in our pursuit of major exercises, which allows a combined force to become more competent in overcoming numerous challenges attendant to big war.
Thanks. Again, you bring up a great point. The thing that I was always most worried about was losing track of equipment that was on a particular ship or on a particular train or in a particular aircraft. So in-sight or in-transit visibility of essential equipment is so important for us. And obviously, we depend about 90% on commercial transportation to deliver all that. And all of this accountability is based on automated systems. So thanks for reminding us of how we have to keep practicing this, not just for the troops, but also for the vendors, the people, the stevedores that work at the ports, and everybody is automated. How do they do this process? Okay, Sabina, let me come to you now. As a journalist who's covered this topic, what are some of the cyber attacks on critical infrastructure that were aimed at destabilizing other countries that you have observed? You're still muted, Sabina.
Well, thanks very much, General Van Hodges, to invite me to join CEPA meeting today. The information I can give you is just the open source. That means that's information that people, institutions, and other parties are giving me. So everything else is invisible to me. And when I prepared this panel, I saw that there's a lot of press releases on cyber incidents. But if you go back to the bodies and you ask for information, then you really get very little. So let me give you an overview of what I gained from institutions. I'm not relying on press releases today here. So I reviewed what the BSI, that's the Bundesamt für Sicherheit in Informationstechnik, it's the Federal Office for Information Security, gave for 2019. Okay, so we have 1,500 critical infrastructures in Germany, and there have been reported 252 incidents. Okay, so what's interesting about this is where have these attacks been? And I was looking at the figures, and I found that 23% is IT and telecommunication, 19% is transport system, 11% is energy. So here the transport system with 1/5 almost is a quite high number, and it's quite interesting for our topic today. BSI does not give concrete examples, okay? So we have had reports on attacks on critical infrastructure over and over again in Germany, but this was on the energy and on companies mostly, not so much on transport systems. I just recall you were mentioning before, we did with our journalistic work, we tried to penetrate ourselves, and we have seen small companies that are offering transport systems that sometimes they're really easy to breach. Okay, so we did some research on that, and we published some of the results of those incidents. So I must say, and I can state here, that the smaller the entities get, the easier it is to breach them. And this is something we can observe, that there is a decentralization of transport systems being offered in Germany and also throughout Europe. And the smaller they get, the more easy they are a target. Okay, so what is interesting though? Okay, so yes, I see you making a sign. Stop. I stop here.
All right. Well, let me follow up with you on that. I had the chance to visit an official inside the German Ministry of Interior who is an expert on the topic, and has some responsibility. And I asked him about who was responsible for the cyber protection of Munich Airport, because Munich Airport is one of the airfields that U.S. troops might have to fly into, for example. And he said, so he said it's a commercial airport, it's not a government airport. So he said there's probably a vendor that would be responsible for the cyber protection of all of Munich Airport. Is that your information as well? Exactly.
You're coming to a very important point. So who is in charge of IT security and critical infrastructure in Germany? And it's not as you could assume, it's not the Bundeswehr, the Federal Armed Forces of Germany, and it's also not any other official body. It's not the BSI. It's not the Federal Office for Information Security. It is the private sector that is responsible. Okay, so we have a law, and it says it's a critical infrastructure law, and it says that every single institution, every single enterprise, every single airport or transport company has to make sure that the critical infrastructure is safe. And so the BSI offers information, and you have to report to them if there is incidents. As I mentioned before, those figures come from the incidents being reported to BSI. But when it comes to the security, there is the law that obliges the entities to make sure they have that the critical infrastructure is safe, in quotes. But there is actually no governmental body that really is responsible for that. It's the private sector.
So one final additional follow-up to you. So as far as your reporting shows, you're not aware that there's a government agency from the German federal government where somebody goes to a airport or a seaport or a particular vendor and has a checklist and says, here's the standards that you're meeting or not meeting?
No, it's not like that. I mean, there is standards that are being adjusted every year or every now and then. But what security is to be unbreachable, or at least state of the art unbreachable, and how you reach that, really, that's up to you as a private partner. I want to add one thing, and I think that really, although it's not concerning exactly our topic, but I think it's really, it will have an impact. It's what the EU Council said on the 17th of May 2019, when there was a framework established to take measures after a cyber attack to go after cyber attackers. And that happened now with the German parliament attack. Mrs. Merkel just put sanctions. She wants sanctions, and put sanctions against a Russian citizen. And I think this EU Council framework that just has been established, I think that could be be like a sign for a new shield. Attackers maybe will be a bit more careful in the future. It could have an impact on the security. Yeah. Okay,
thanks for that. And we're already starting to get questions coming in. In fact, one of our listeners has a question about how the EU can assist. So we'll come back to that. Each nation is going to require help, but also standards, because we are all so interconnected. Thanks, Sabina. Edvinas, I met you early last year, when you were still the Deputy Defense Minister, and you gave a wonderful presentation about Lithuania's model and system for protecting cyber throughout the region. And I was struck because it became clear to me immediately that you were talking about not just cyber or systems within the Ministry of Defense, but everything throughout the country. Could you talk about that? How did you develop that model? How did Lithuania arrive at that solution?
Sure. Hello, General, colleagues. Actually, to some, good morning, to others, good evening. You are very right. 4 years ago, we acknowledged that we have a lot of problems in the country. On one hand, we could learn from history, because we already know how it is easy to lose independence, right? You are weak, you are not ready, and you are gone. We were gone for 50 years. We were under occupation of Russia. The second thing is that we realized that threats were not leaving somewhere, right? They were somewhere around us, but changing forms, adopting. If previously we were seeing different type of attacks, cyber attacks separate from information attacks, physical attacks, not electronic or digital attacks. So we recognized that world is changing so fast that you need to do something differently to be ahead. Otherwise, you're losing, right? You are leaving behind. And third thing was that in Ministry of Defense, in military, we knew one very important rule, which is serve as you fight, right? So you need to have capabilities now in peacetime, so you are ready in crisis or wartime or in a very difficult situation. You need to know what kind of critical infrastructure you have in the country. You need to be ready to protect it in crisis time. But when crisis comes, you don't have time, or wartime when comes, you don't have time. And we can learn from Georgians or Crimea's scenario, when everything is moving so fast that you don't have any time to do exercises, trainings, or changing systems. So what we decided to centralize everything and put under Ministry of Defense umbrella, which means that we will not be dividing cyberspace into pieces, kind of, this is critical infrastructure, this is personal, business, government, or military space. No, this is one big space, and threats normally come from two directions, from outside or from inside. So if you want to be ready at crisis time, you need to fight cyber threats in peacetime. So that was the idea we came up, and we immediately started adopting the system in the country.
Edvinas, two quick follow-ups. First, your neighbors, Latvia, for example, Latvians have told me that they have a similar model to what Lithuania has. I'm not sure how Poland does this. How much cooperation and sharing of this have you seen with Latvia, for example, or Poland?
Well, we have, first of all, we have Baltic region and our cooperation 3B, and then 3B plus US, which means closest stakeholders and partners. And another thing I will talk a little bit later, because I already heard a question about what EU can do. I will come up with another Lithuanian initiative, which is called Cyber Rapid Response Team Project, meaning and finding Poland and Estonians and Netherlands and other countries cooperating on one platform, sharing not information, but people, technologies, knowledges, and fighting as one team in crisis scenario.
Okay, thanks. I am going to come back to you on that EU question. Jaak, as the director of the Cyber Center of Excellence, and I recognize you are not representing official NATO policy on this. You're speaking as the director of the Cyber Center, and you can differentiate when it's personal or whatever as necessary. But I had the chance to visit the Center of Excellence just a few years ago, and I've always thought it was one of the most effective of all of NATO's centers of excellence, and it seems so relevant. So let me come to you with this. Cybersecurity of transportation infrastructure is necessary for NATO to maintain mission assurance. In this respect, the cyber domain is quite unique, as cybersecurity and resiliency of dual use transportation infrastructure is provided largely by private companies and not the military. Thus, the operation and security measures of ports, railways, and electricity providers does not fall under the purview of the ministries of defense in each nation. How can NATO maintain mission assurance if military mobility depends on privately owned and operated infrastructure?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the kind words regarding the center. It's really been a tremendous honor to work with such a bright team of international experts there, and I'm always the least competent person in the center. I don't have a cyber background. I've been in this business now for almost 2 years. So I always try to talk cyber, in layman's terms, understandable to people who, are not cyber experts like myself. So in this case, I want to go back to my childhood. It reminds me of a story. And when we talk about civilian infrastructure that needs to be ready for military use, it reminds me, growing up under Soviet occupation, watching a bridge going up, bridge construction with my dad, and I said, "Wow, Dad, that's a small bridge, and that's a big bridge on this small road." And Dad said, well, yeah, it needs to withstand the T-72 tank. And I asked why. And then I remember my dad kind of going quiet because he realized when he tells me the real story of the nature of the Soviet state, I would go to school and get the family in trouble, you know. So he wiggled out of the situation somehow, but the entire infrastructure was geared for the war effort, everything. And it made it kind of easy for the war machine. It was centrally planned, executed, but it made the system in the end collapse because it was so inefficient for the civilian life. It might have prevailed in war at its peak, but it you know, didn't. So now in the cyber era, I'm on the right side of the borderline between tyranny and freedom, and it's good to be on this side. But being in the military, looking at the infrastructure, gosh, it's tough. I think most military people would love to have that centrally planned and executed, that every bridge must meet the standards, every weather station must have cybersecurity standards, airports, ports, everything. And it's moving in the right direction. Governments are working on it. For the businesses, unfortunately, it has been mostly kind of a overhead cost. Investing in the cybersecurity doesn't bring anything to the stockholders. It's a loss. The 2017 NotPetya that you mentioned, sir, in the article, in the Wired article, it really brought it to the private industry as well. And I think Maersk itself said they're going to make it their business case of being the most cybersecure logistics company. So it is vitally important. And let's not fool ourselves. Russia knows our weakness. NATO has 30 nations, 30 different processes for governing their national infrastructure and cybersecurity of it. They will try to exploit the vulnerabilities if it comes to that. Sir, I'll let you come back with another question if you want to.
Yeah, actually, I love the fact that you speak in layman's terms, because what we're after is the development of policy to make sure that all of our infrastructure is protected. And the policymakers are not going to be cyber geeks. They're going to be normal people that work in parliament and government administrations. And so being able to convey in layman's terms why this matters is actually quite helpful, obviously assisted by some of those cyber geeks. Let me ask, there's a couple of questions that are already coming in, and I think with you as the director of the Center of Excellence would be useful. From Peter Borisov, he asked, what is or what should or what could be the best role for Ukraine in supporting cybersecurity and digital defense in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region? And maybe if I adjust that a little bit, what have we learned from Ukraine there that is useful for the rest of us?
Right. Well, since 2007, Estonia was the nation that had battle scars of digital attack by Russia on a politically motivated basis. And we used it to build a very resilient national system. Now, Ukraine and their cybersecurity experts have a tremendous expertise in defending daily Russian high-level APT attacks. NotPetya was mentioned. It was Russian APT, advanced precision threat attack against Ukrainian system, which spread across the world. So it will be great to get there kind of as much intimate network logs and data as possible for the Western experts to analyze. I hope some intel agencies are getting them and sharing it. I know that they are receiving great cybersecurity training funded by EU and NATO, and sometimes from private companies, sometimes from government agencies. So it's very important to help them as much as possible, but also to try to gain their knowledge what the daily high-level attacks on their networks are like.
Thanks very much for that. And the Cyber Center of Excellence is the place that really helps pull a lot of that together. Edvinas, I'd like to come back to you with a question. from Charles Hanses. He asked, how can the EU, the European Union, assist in ensuring that critical infrastructure is better protected in between countries?
Okay, as I mentioned a couple of years ago, we came up with an idea that, it's not enough to share information. You need to share something more. You need to work closely to each other so you are stronger. So at the moment, the project is already launched. All necessary documents, including MOU and legal framework, are signed. So we already know how legally in the EU we can assist each other. And the main idea of the project is that we are building operational capabilities from people physically working in different countries. Meaning, at the moment, we have a team that is built from people from Poland, Netherlands, Estonia, Lithuania, and we are in charge. And we are operational 24/7, and we are ready to launch this team, and it can be sent to any part of the world to do their job. In the first phase, we are talking about EU countries and supporting EU institutions and each other. But another aim is to be able to help and support our friends, meaning countries outside EU, like, for example, Ukraine. If their electricity grid would be under attack again, we could launch this team. They could jump into the plane, go to the place, deploy their tools, and start working in the place where the incident is starting. So EU is already doing this project, and it's moving quite fast, and it's part of building more capabilities to defend our countries.
Edvinas, let me come back to you. One of the things that struck me when at your presentation early last year, when I asked you if this investment in cyber protection of all the infrastructure that was not defense necessarily, such as those seaport at Klaipėda, if that counted towards Lithuania's 2%, their NATO pledge, and you said yes. Could you explain that, and what did you how did you work that out? How did y'all work that out with the headquarters in Brussels?
Well, for us, it's all clear. This critical infrastructure in peacetime is supporting the country. In crisis or wartime, it supports our capabilities and our partners that need to come to our territory. You mentioned Klaipėda port. It's critical for our NATO allies to move and to enter Baltic region, because if you don't have access to air, water, and land, you are done in our region. We are, on the eastern border of NATO and EU, so everything that is critical infrastructure is critical for military purposes. So for us, it's all clear. We have a special law, and we protect those critical infrastructures. Okay, there is dual protected mechanism. On one hand, those companies are in charge of implementation specific requirements that Ministry of Defense is releasing. But on another hand, we have defense plan. We use special technologies that we put on site and protect those critical infrastructures from very difficult and comprehensive espionage attacks and other cyber attacks. So it's dual responsibility. National Cybersecurity Center from one side and company business from another side.
Thanks for that. I wish that other countries would figure out using their own model, but a way to get credit towards their 2% is to incentivize that, because for sure the alliance depends on transportation infrastructure in Germany, in Poland, in Romania, Netherlands, and so on. All right, this next question is from Frank Holcomb, and I'm going to come back to all four of you, and this will be the sequence, so you have a chance to kind of think about it. It's about some examples of successes, well, good news basically, and the order, after I read the question, I'll come to Sabina, and then Tom, and then Jaak, and then Edvinas. in this order. Okay, here's the question from Frank. The Euro-Atlantic community faces numerous serious cyber threats, which must be actively highlighted. But what are some of the good news stories about recent developments in Euro-Atlantic cyber defense of key infrastructure? In other words, I mean, we're doing a good job of highlighting the challenges, which is what we should do, but also a lot of work has been done to help improve this, because in each country, people like you recognize what needs to be done. So maybe some examples of successes that you've heard about, large or small. So Sabina, let me come to you first. You're still muted.
I think a success and contributing a lot of insight and help is ENISA, the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, because it offers the players actively information like preparing to the offense of cyber attacks by simulating cyber attacks. I think that might be a good example of what's happening. So, and again, the problem, because attacks that haven't been taken place are not being reported on, mostly not. I cannot, as a press speaker here, give an example, because there is almost none. We have seen Ukraine with all the bad examples as a field of intrusion for Russian activists for a long time. It doesn't seem to stop. In other countries, we don't have so much information, nor on the good side, nor on the bad side. So I would like to give the question back to you.
Okay, thanks. Tom Greenwood, in your work there at IDA or your own personal experiences, have you seen some examples of where the government or any of the departments or businesses are taking the right steps?
Yes, and I think there's some real progress being made, both here in the States as well as in Europe and abroad, in the sense that we're not just waiting for our adversaries to make us more alert to the vulnerabilities of these systems, but we're actually building them into our training exercises. So, for example, at the National Training Center, cyber is a part of the scenario there. There's actually an opposing force, cyber opposing force, and so we get to train U.S. forces on a training network that is especially built so it's not disruptive of California's overall internet. But this is huge in that we challenge ourselves in peacetime to be more prepared, and I think that's going on in NATO as well as in the Pacific theater.
Yeah, you know, I remember General Paul Nakasone, the commander, the senior cyber commander for the United States Department of Defense. I heard him about a year back in early 2016 say that his main effort was 2018, was the protection of the upcoming midterm elections, which was outside the normal where the Department of Defense does things, but he had been tasked to help provide protection of our midterm elections, which I think made a lot of sense, and where they've got capability. Okay, Jaak, what is the Center of Excellence seeing best practices maybe that you would want to talk about?
Well, sir, first, it's very hard to measure things that did not happen. So it's hard to say why NATO nations' critical infrastructure hasn't been hit hard. But I would give some credit, and a lot of credit, to NATO policy actions. In 2014, NATO at its highest level at the Heads of State and Government Summit declared that cyber attack can be met with collective response, either in cyber or kinetic means. That adds to the deterrence posture. The potential perpetrator knows that if it causes significant damage and or human casualties with the cyber attack, it can be attacked, even kinetic means, collectively by NATO. I think it does add to deterrence. Later, NATO went on in 2016 to declare cyberspace as a space of operations where NATO must be able to defend itself as it does in air, land, and sea. In 2018 came the operational pieces when NATO said that NATO will use offensive cyber if NATO nations bring it to the NATO operations. So I think NATO is on the right track, and it's by far not a sleeping giant.
Great points. Thanks. Okay, Edvinas.
Well, I would highlight two things that NATO is doing quite good now. First of all, they are doing quite good job in training capabilities, building infrastructures and programs to have as much as possible people that know what cybersecurity and issues are. So if we have critical number of people well prepared in our capabilities, in our forces, we will be more secure, better prepared. Second thing that I would like to highlight is preparation. Well, for example, NATO Energy Center of Excellence did a great job doing cyber risk study of Central Europe pipeline systems, which is again critical infrastructure, right? Pipelines that are critical for Europe. And when you know where the threat is or where your weak points are, you again can better prepare yourself to protect those infrastructures and to use best practices in the future. So those two things I would highlight.
Edvinas, thank you. The next question is from, by the way, I'm going to give all four of you a chance here in about 10 minutes as we get down to our last five. We call it the lightning round, where each of you gets 1 minute to make that main point that you didn't get to make or that you want to reinforce. Okay, so if everybody's going to get one more crack at it here. This next question is from one of the best soldiers I know, Major General J.J. Berdila, who is the commander of Romania's land forces. And General Berdila asked the question, with increasing 5G competition, how can NATO forward presence build, he calls it a sort of A2AD of cyber defense, including for military mobility. So as we look at the competition for networks, how do we still protect our assets in a multinational environment? Let's try out Colonel Greenwood. Tom.
So one of the key advantages of peacetime exercises done at scale is not just to enhance readiness, but I think there's a very important aspect of signaling to our adversaries who are always watching, listening, and assessing our aggregate capabilities that are being displayed by US and NATO forces. So as we work to protect infrastructure and demonstrate logistical capability in moving forces both to the theater from the United States as well as intra-theater movement, we need to remain cognizant of the other domains, sea, air, space, and cyber. And as we design exercises, be sure that we're taking that all domain approach, because our adversaries are, again, watching for our capabilities, not just in one area on land or on sea or in air, but across all the 5 domains as well as the electromagnetic spectrum. And so we need to appreciate this signaling aspect. For many years, every year we did Team Spirit in South Korea. President Kim Il-sung in North Korea, he mobilized his reserves and he repositioned his air and naval and land forces every year in response to our doing exercise Team Spirit. So that was both a cost-imposing exercise, both economically and politically. And again, we need to take that approach, and I think show that in fact NATO is very capable of creating its own A2AD bubbles, within Europe.
Super, thank you very much. And seeing General Berdila also reminds me that Thursday night or Thursday afternoon, CEPA will have another panel. This is on what's the strategic significance of the Black Sea region. We've got another great panel that's going to talk about the Black Sea in general and why it matters to the West. Jaak, you want to make a contribution here?
The 5G debate is fascinating. The pre-COVID-19 pandemic, there were only few nations siding with the United States, saying that it must be trusted equipment. We cannot buy Chinese for our, secure communications that 5G will be. Now the dynamics with the Chinese actions during the pandemic, more nations are waking up and seeing that, well, yeah, you can't always trust China. The easy example here is if Russia had an advanced electronic industry and they made really good, cheap, and efficient voting machines, would we buy them for our democratic elections? Probably not. So I'm a great advocate of defending forward. Can we call it A2AD bubble? But my own law branch sometimes tells me that what I advocate is not in accordance with the international law as they see it, but having trusted equipment at home and sometimes having forward presence in your adversaries' servers is necessary because they are doing it.
Yeah, Sabina. You're muted.
I think it's very, I agree with you. I think it's very important to discuss the digital sovereignty, the supply chain, who is using what kind of supply here, the 5G, where is it bought, is it Chinese, is it not? Because the whole chain can only be as secure as the weakest point is. So I think awareness in the public is not quite at the level, and I can only talk here for the press, and my perception is that digital sovereignty is not only a military discussion, it also has to come to the civil sector, because we are talking here about military mobility, and it's also civil mobility, it's also civil devices, and we also will use 5G here. So we have to discuss the whole supply chain.
Thanks very much. Okay, this next question is from Ian Anthony. Says the EU recovery plan for COVID-19 includes building secure and trustworthy infrastructure to promote the digital economy. How can military technology innovation support competitive commercial projects in the private sector? Edvinas, you've just made the transition from government to commercial. Could you talk about how one can complement the other? You're muted.
Sorry, but one of the idea we came up a couple of years ago was a risk fund, meaning that MOD finances some technologies that on one hand might be very important to use in military or protection on critical infrastructure. On another hand, could be part of business product and could be later on adopted and used in other companies, in other businesses. So this is a new project we've started, and to be very honest, I think it has future, because those dual use technologies might be used in civil life and in military life. So we provide ideas, we provide our needs, companies take risk, get finance, create products, adopt them, and afterwards evaluate, sell on the market. That's the model we are using now.
Okay, here's another, I think this is a fascinating question. It's a simple question, but it's very important. How do you manage the balance between centralized cyber defense of all cyber domains and the privacy of your citizens in Lithuania? This is from Arda Tapan. Edvinas, I'm going to come back to you. How did you must have gone through discussions about this, and then Sabina, I'll ask your perspective on this balance of privacy and defense. So Edvinas.
Very good question. And actually 4 years ago we got an advice from our stakeholders from United States. They said, hey guys, first of all, build your legal system and be sure that everything is clear to everyone. Who is responsible for what kind of audit mechanisms do you have in place, so that no one would doubt that you are using some tools or technologies that are not aligning with people privacies and so on. So until now, more than 2 years passed when the system is running and all legal things are in place, and we did not have any a case where there would be some doubts or legal issues concerning privacy and our intervention. More, you can always recheck. There is a special mechanism, recheck what we do, how we deal with private data. And besides, in EU, it's again very, very strict because of GDPR and other requirements. Wow. You need to be very well prepared, and we are.
Thanks. Sabina, from a German perspective, how do you balance the privacy issue? You're on mute. There you go.
Well, as Edvinas already mentioned, we have the GDPR, which is very powerful and strong, and there's a lot of high fees to be paid by people infringing. So people are, I think, fairly well protected here. And when it comes to security issues, and when a government wants to implement new things and needs data in order to do so, we can watch that now with the COVID app. You can see that there's a big reluctance, although it touches people, I mean, on a level that is it's fairly well and understood. It's concerning their health. Nevertheless, people don't want the app installed because of privacy reasons. So if there is new things to be installed and or necessary from a military perspective, the only way to do so and to get a progress is to raise awareness what's at risk. And I think maybe the awareness is much more visible in Ukraine than it is in Germany, because they have had more impacts. So I guess we need a discussion on the European Union level of all countries to make it really known what's being at risk, what's being at stake. And I think, in my perspective, that's not done enough.
All right. Thanks, all of you. So there's 4 questions we didn't get to because we're out of time, and I do want to do the lightning round, but I just want to give you a flavor of the ones we did not get to. Number 1, could the EU Rapid Reaction Support Team have assisted the Bulgarian government when their tax system was hacked and so much information was released? There was another question. We were all surprised by the coronavirus. Don't you think we could be surprised by a massive cyber attack on our infrastructure if we don't redesign our computer systems and networks? Do we need to start over with that? And then there was an interesting question about how much we depend on space-based systems for navigation and so many other aspects. Communications, obviously, what we do. Are our space-based platforms adequately protected as well? And then finally, there's so many different aspects to the challenge. Where do these challenges, where are they brought together for one review? We talk about integrated air and missile defense, for example, but do we have an integrating function that looks at cyber protection of all of our transportation infrastructure? Okay, so it's time for lightning round now. We'll go in the original order with Tom, and then Sabina, and then Edvinas and Jaak. You get 1 minute each to make you don't have to use the whole minute, by the way, to make your final point. Go ahead, Tom.
My final point is that in times of fiscal austerity, military forces obviously look for ways to reduce defense costs. And this typically involves trying to substitute major field exercises with less expensive workshops, seminars, tactical exercises without troops, map rehearsals, computer simulations, and the like. And while these are all valuable tools and venues that should be heavily leveraged and exploited, they are no substitute for having major exercises with joint and combined forces at scale that are asked to do demanding things on the ground, at sea, in air and space, as well as the electromagnetic spectrum. Point number two related to that is we need to remember who the target audience is of these major exercises. It's not the individual soldier or even the company and battalion level, okay? Yeah, in my view, it's senior political and military leaders of the participating countries and building muscle memory at their level in terms of making timely decisions, exercising command and control, sharing intelligence, moving combat formations at great distances, and having to sustain them under adverse conditions. And hopefully, the COVID-19 pandemic and economic downturns in many of our countries won't result in lower readiness because we stop conducting major training exercises.
Tom, thanks. Good, strong finish. Sabina.
Okay, my main point. I think we have to consider the big problem of IoT. IoT with vulnerabilities, that is the big cyber weapon. And we have faced that in Germany. Telecommunication was taken down by baby phones and TV cameras. So I think we need better legislations here. I can only talk for the European Union. When I look at what we have, you can still import IoT that's purely designed with vulnerabilities. It's not forbidden to put it on the market. And I think we need better legislation there. We need certifications, standards, which are not implemented so far. And I think that will be a big task, and it should be completed very soon.
Excellent. Sabina, thanks. When I first met you at the Munich Security Conference about 5 years ago, you impressed me, and you're still going strong. Edvinas.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm pretty sure that every country needs to find their own way on doing cybersecurity. If everyone is doing something in one way, it doesn't mean that it's the only way you can fight it, right? So try to find your own way, do things that no one is doing. Second thing, which is for me very, very much important, that alone you are in a trouble. You need to find your partners, your stakeholders, and when you do that, then you train together, work or fight together, and do R&D together. So find new things, new technologies, new ways, new methods, how you fight those threats that are evolving every day. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. Jaak.
Train your people at all levels. Our Center of Excellence runs the world's largest, most complex live-fire cyber defense exercise, Locked Shields. It used to be technical exercise. Together with commercial partners, we built the real lifelike networks, power grids, water stations, military systems. Now, in the last 3 years, we've added a strategic layer to it. So we're inviting, in addition to the national certs that usually train there, we are inviting nations to put their strategic teams there, like their decision makers in the Ministry of Defense, Foreign Affairs, governmental levels, of the get idea what it's like when their nation is under cyber attack. It's really a key point because I don't think all the strategic leaders still get it. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I like the emphasis on training, and of course that applies to civilian businesses and vendors, as well as military organizations. And Tommy, you mentioned the Defender 21 exercise that's coming up next year, and it'll be oriented into the Balkans and to Romania. We'll be using, I think they plan to use 5 different seaports on the Adriatic and in the Aegean and perhaps in the Black Sea. So seaports as well as rail networks and road networks, perhaps U.S. European Command and NATO and U.S. Army Europe will inject some disruptions into the transportation networks as part of the exercise in some aspect. Maybe you need to write another article about how you would design such an exercise, get that in War on the Rocks. I think that would be a good one and get a bunch of evaluators from the Center of Excellence to go down there and watch and see how the different institutions respond. But let me wrap this up. Very grateful for the insights that all of you have shared. The emphasis on military mobility is not because we want to make it easier for units to go out and do exercises. Military mobility is what gives our political leaders options, the ability to move quickly, either to prevent a crisis or to prevent it from escalating or to respond to a crisis. Whether we're talking about a potential Russian incursion into Lithuania or Romania, or as seems increasingly possible, or not likely, but possible, a requirement on short notice to put European troops into Libya to head off a massive refugee flow resulting from the fighting that's going on there now between the GNA forces and General Haftar's forces, aided by Russian Air Force. The ability to cross borders, the infrastructure to support it, and then the cyber protection for this is all about giving political leaders options so that we can move as fast or faster than the crisis. Thanks to all of you, and best wishes to you and your family for good health.